You're 12 years old, and the morning mist clings to the stone steps of the monastery like ghostly fingers. Your bare feet have gone numb from the cold as you kneel silently, waiting. An older monk approaches, his silk robes whispering against the wooden floors with each deliberate step. You've learned not to meet his eyes directly. He sweeps his gaze over your trembling form with the calculated assessment of a merchant examining precious goods. When his weathered hand finally touches your shoulder, you feel the weight of your new life settling around you like chains of ceremony and shame. This is your first morning as a chigo, a temple boy, though you don't yet understand that your childhood has been sold to satisfy hungers that have no name in your small, frightened world. The incense burns thick in the prayer hall, but can't mask the scent of fear clinging to your skin. Behind you, in the shadows between the towering Buddha statues, other boys like you move with practiced silence. Some have been here for months, others for years. Their eyes hold secrets. You're not ready to understand secrets about what happens when the temple bells stop ringing and the world outside these walls forgets you exist. Welcome to medieval Japan, where beauty was currency and innocence a commodity consumed by those with power. Welcome to a world where the line between spiritual devotion and physical exploitation blurred until it disappeared, leaving behind only echoes of young voices never meant to break. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history not taught in class, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. It's incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The story of male concubinage in ancient Japan isn't just about individual suffering. It's about entire systems designed to consume young lives. These weren't isolated incidents of abuse, but carefully constructed traditions that spanned centuries, woven into the fabric of Japanese society, from Buddhist temples to samurai castles to the floating world of Edo's pleasure quarters. In the mountain monastery of Koyasan, dawn breaks over a scene that repeats itself thousands of times across medieval Japan. Young boys, some as young as 10, are prepared for a life they cannot comprehend. Their hair is arranged in the specific style of the chigo, partially shaved, with remaining locks carefully groomed to emphasize their youth and beauty. They wear silk robes that set them apart, elevating them above ordinary temple servants. But these beautiful garments are truly just gilded cages. The institution of chigo, male child attendants in Buddhist temples, began in the Heian period, around the 9th century AD. These boys were chosen not for their spiritual devotion or intellectual promise, but for their physical beauty. Families, often desperate for economic relief or social advancement, would literally sell their sons to monasteries. The official story was education and spiritual guidance, but the reality was far more sinister. Records from temples across Japan reveal a systematic approach to acquiring these boys. Monks would travel to villages during times of famine or economic hardship, offering to educate male children in exchange for payments to the families. Some parents genuinely believed they were providing their sons with opportunities for advancement, while others knew exactly what they were selling, but felt they had no choice. Once within the temple walls, the transformation of these children began immediately. The older monk assigned as a spiritual guide, called a ninja, would start molding his young charge. This relationship, known as nanshoku, or male colors, was portrayed as a sacred bond between master and student. In reality, it was institutionalized sexual abuse, disguised as religious ceremony. The daily routine of a chigo was a carefully orchestrated performance of subjugation. Before dawn, they would rise to attend to their ninja's personal needs, preparing his bath, laying out his robes, serving his meals. They learned to move with the fluid grace expected of them, to speak only when spoken to anticipate their master's desires before they were voiced. Every aspect of their behavior was scrutinized and corrected. The physical abuse began gradually, often disguised as instruction in spiritual intimacy. The older monks had elaborate philosophies to justify their actions, claiming that pure love between man and boy could lead to enlightenment. Buddhist texts were twisted to support these practices, with the concept of universal compassion perverted into a justification for sexual exploitation. Temple records from the medieval period, preserved in monasteries like Enryakuji on Mount Hiei, contain cryptic references to the education of chigo. These documents use euphemistic language, but their meaning becomes clear when examined alongside personal diaries and letters that have survived. One 12th century monk's diary describes his instruction of a young boy named Kikumaru, detailing how he gradually introduced the child to increasingly intimate lessons under the guise of spiritual training. The isolation of mountain monasteries made resistance nearly impossible. These boys had no contact with the outside world, no way to communicate with their families, and no understanding that what was happening to them was wrong. They were taught that their suffering was sacred, believing submission was a spiritual discipline that would benefit them in future lives. The psychological manipulation was perhaps even more devastating than the physical abuse. The monks created elaborate ceremonies around their exploitation, turning rape into ritual. Special seasonal festivals celebrated the bond between ninja and chigo, with the entire temple community involved in pageants showcasing the boys' beauty and submission. Some chigo attempted to resist. Temple punishment records, hidden in monastery archives, reveal the brutal consequences. Boys who refused their ninja's advances faced starvation, solitary confinement, and violent beatings. Some were permanently disfigured as warnings to others. The documents describe punishments with clinical detachment, detailing days without food, lashes with bamboo switches, and the spiritual correction needed to restore obedience. The most haunting records come from boys who internalized their abuse, competing for their abuser's attention. Temple writings describe chigo performing increasingly degrading acts to gain favor, betraying other boys to protect their own positions. The system didn't just abuse these children, it taught them to abuse themselves and each other. As these boys approached adolescence, around 14 or 15, their time as chigo would typically end. Their voices would crack, and their bodies would lose the androgynous beauty that had made them valuable. Some would remain as junior monks, forever scarred by their experiences. Others were cast out into a world they no longer understood, with no resources or support. The lucky ones, if they can be called that, found their way to the samurai class. The warrior culture of medieval Japan had adopted the nanshoku traditions from Buddhist monasteries, but with their own violent twist. While temples cloaked their abuse in spiritual language, the samurai were more direct. In the military compounds and castle towns of feudal Japan, young boys, now called wakachu, served similar functions to the temple chigo, but their suffering was flavored with the casual brutality of warrior culture. These boys, typically between 12 and 16, were taken as apprentices by adult samurai. The official purpose was to learn martial arts, strategy, and the code of Bushido. The reality was that they served as sexual slaves for men who glorified violence. The selection process for wakushu was even more ruthless than in the temples. Samurai would literally purchase boys from their families, treating them like weapons or horses, valuable tools to be owned and used. Some were from samurai families that had fallen on hard times, while others were sons of merchants or farmers seeking ties to the warrior class. all quickly learned their bodies were not their own. Historical records from the Kamakura period, 1185–1333 AD, frequently mention the trading of wakashu among samurai. Letters between warrior lords evaluated their boys with the same language used for swords or armor. A 1267 document describes a samurai, Minamoto Yoshitsune, trading 2 wakashu to another lord for a fine horse, noting both boys were well trained in submission and skilled in the art of pleasure. Wakashu training involved both martial and sexual education, often simultaneously. They learned to fight with weapons while being taught to submit sexually to their masters. This blend of violence and intimacy created a particularly twisted form of indoctrination. Boys excelling in both areas were prized, loaned to other samurai as gestures of friendship or political alliance. The famous military chronicle, the Heike Monogatari, contains veiled references to this practice, describing how young warriors served their lords in all things, both in battle and private chambers. The language is euphemistic, but historical context clarifies the meaning. These boys were expected to be ready to die for their masters in battle and submit to them sexually in peacetime. Personal accounts from this period, preserved in family archives, reveal the psychological devastation inflicted on these young warriors. One wakashu, Taira Shigemori, left a secret diary, discovered centuries later in a hidden compartment of an old samurai residence. His entries describe years of ritualized abuse disguised as warrior training. He writes of being forced to show loyalty to his master in increasingly degrading ways, competing with other wakashu for scraps of approval, and learning to suppress all natural reactions to pain and humiliation. The samurai developed elaborate ceremonies around the exploitation of wakashu. Brotherhood contracts formalized these relationships, were public documents signed before witnesses and blessed by Shinto priests. These contracts outlined the sexual duties of the younger partner, cloaked in the language of honor and loyalty. The boys pledged to serve faithfully in body and spirit, while their masters promised to guide them in warrior virtue. Most chillingly, these contracts often included clauses for if the wakashu tried to resist or escape. Penalties ranged from ritual scarring to execution, presented as natural consequences for breaking sacred oaths. The samurai legal code, the Goshibai Shikimoku, included specific rules for handling disobedient male attendants, equating their resistance to military desertion. The competitive nature of samurai culture extended to their treatment of wakashu. Lords would showcase their boys at formal gatherings, comparing their beauty and training as they might compare their weapons or horses. Special contests were held where wakashu demonstrated their skills, both martial and sexual, for the entertainment of their master's guests. Winners were rewarded, while losers faced punishment severe enough to cause permanent damage. Some wakashu, desperate to escape, sought protection through converting to Buddhism or fleeing to distant provinces. Temple records show many were returned by monks who refused to shelter runaway property. Provincial authorities, reliant on local samurai lords, typically returned escaped wakashu, often after punishing them for causing trouble. The most successful wakashu, those who completed their apprenticeships without lasting harm, sometimes became samurai themselves, but they bore the scars of their experiences. Historical records suggest many of these men later took their own wakashu, continuing the cycle of abuse they endured in their youth. As Japan entered the Edo period, from 1603 to Wentamon the Fan, the practice of keeping male concubines evolved into the commercial sphere of urban pleasure districts. The rigid social hierarchy of Tokugawa Japan created new markets for sexual exploitation, and young men were commodified in ways unimaginable in earlier times. The great cities of Edo, now Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto, became magnets for displaced samurai, ambitious merchants, and families seeking economic opportunity. This population concentration created demand for sexual services and a supply of vulnerable young people. Authorities, instead of suppressing these activities, chose to regulate and profit from them. Male prostitutes in the Edo period were known as kegama, meaning shadow actors, capturing the ambiguous nature of their existence. They were both performers and sexual servants, existing in the shadows between respectable society and the criminal underworld. Unlike their predecessors in temples and samurai compounds, kegama operated in a marketplace where their suffering could be bought and sold by anyone with enough money. The development of licensed pleasure quarters like Yoshihara in Edo represented a new form of institutionalized exploitation. While these districts are often remembered for their female courtesans, they also housed thousands of male prostitutes serving clients of all genders. The government's licensing system gave an appearance of legitimacy, while ensuring profits from sexual exploitation went to official coffers. The procurement methods for kegama were as systematic as those for temple chigo and samurai wakashu, but adapted to urban commercial realities. Procurers, known as zigen, would scout rural areas during economic hardship, offering to apprentice young boys in the entertainment trades. Families devastated by poor harvests or heavy taxation would sell their sons for immediate cash, often through contracts amounting to indentured servitude, lasting 10 years or more. Records from the Yoshihara Pleasure Quarter, preserved in the Tokyo Metropolitan Archives, reveal the harsh economics of male prostitution. Boys as young as 11 were bought for amounts equivalent to several years' income for a common laborer. The contracts specified they would work until they had earned back their purchase price, plus interest, room and board, clothing, and various fees. The calculations ensured most would never achieve freedom. The daily life of kegama was a performance of perpetual availability. They lived in specialized brothels called kegama jaya, or shadow tea houses, where they were displayed for customers like merchandise. Their rooms were designed to showcase their beauty, with screens painted with erotic imagery, silk bedding in colors chosen to complement their skin tones, and incense burners filling the air with supposedly aphrodisiac scents. Training of kegama began immediately upon arrival in the pleasure quarters. Older prostitutes, victims of the same system, would teach newcomers the arts of seduction, submission, and survival. This education covered everything from sexual techniques to conversation skills, makeup application, and the subtle art of gauging a customer's desires and adapting accordingly. The customer base for kegama reflected the full spectrum of Edo society. Wealthy merchants who couldn't openly keep wakatsu-style concubines would visit kegama houses for discreet encounters. Samurai, now living on fixed stipends in an increasingly commercial economy, could rent what they could no longer afford to own. Even Buddhist monks, supposedly celibate, were regular customers at establishments specializing in boys resembling the chigo of temple life. Personal accounts from kegama, who managed to buy their freedom or escape their contracts, provide devastating insights into the reality behind the romanticized image of Japan's floating world. One such account, preserved in a private collection and only recently studied by historians, comes from a man named Konohika, who worked as a kegama in Osaka from 1687 to 1701. Konoike describes the constant fear permeating kegama life: fear of violent customers, fear of disease, fear of aging out of desirability, fear of brutal punishment for refusing service or attempting escape. He writes about boys who chose suicide over continuing their existence. Others were beaten to death by customers and quickly replaced. There was a casual cruelty that treated people as disposable. The health consequences for kegama were severe and often permanent. With no medical care or protection, they were exposed to every sexually transmitted disease of the time. Many suffered untreated internal injuries from violent customers. Malnutrition was common since brothel owners found it more profitable to spend money on cosmetics and costumes than food. Perhaps most tragically, Kono Heike describes the psychological manipulation used to keep Kagama compliant. Like their temple and samurai predecessors, these boys were taught to blame themselves for their suffering. They were told their beauty was a gift they had a duty to share, that providing pleasure was noble and necessary. Some began to believe these lies, finding twisted pride in their ability to endure degradation. Those who managed to escape or buy their freedom faced a society that offered them no place. They had no families to return to, most having been sold by desperate parents who couldn't take them back. They had no marketable skills beyond those learned in the pleasure quarters and carried diseases and psychological scars, marking them as outcasts. Many returned to prostitution, the only life they knew. The most successful Kagama might eventually run their own establishments, but this success came at the cost of perpetuating the system that destroyed their own childhoods. These men, having survived the worst of commercial sexual exploitation, often became the most ruthless exploiters of the next generation. Government records from the late Edo period show occasional attempts to reform or regulate the treatment of Kagama, but these efforts were superficial. Authorities were more concerned with maintaining tax revenue from the pleasure quarters than protecting the lives of young prostitutes. When brutal incidents reached official attention, the typical response was to transfer problematic brothel owners to different districts rather than prosecute them. The international opening of Japan in the 1850s brought foreign observers who documented what they saw in the pleasure quarters. Their accounts, although often colored by cultural biases, provide external verification of the systematic abuse of Kagama. A British diplomat named Rutherford Alcock wrote extensively about his visits to Edo's entertainment districts, describing scenes of obvious exploitation that shocked him despite his familiarity with prostitution in London. During the Meiji period, from 1868 to 1912, Japan's shift toward modernization led to the decline of traditional systems of male concubinage. This change wasn't driven by humanitarian concerns, but rather by the new government's desire to counter Western criticism of Japanese sexual customs. Eager to present a more civilized image to the world, laws were enacted to prohibit blatant forms of child exploitation. However, enforcement was inconsistent and often more about appearances than genuine care for victims. Records from temples, samurai families, and pleasure quarters reveal patterns that went beyond isolated abuse cases. These were systematic institutions, turning human suffering into spiritual, military, or economic gains for the powerful. The boys and young men trapped in these systems weren't just victims of individual predators, but products of societal structures built on exploitation. Their physical suffering was only the start of their torment. Psychological manipulation, the destruction of their ability to form healthy relationships, and the cultivation of shame and self-hatred inflicted lasting harm. Many bore these wounds for a lifetime, never fully recovering their sense of worth. Tragically, these systems were self-perpetuating. Boys who survived often became the next generation of abusers, knowing no other model of power relationships. This cycle continued for centuries, with trauma passed down through generations. Although rare, resistance did occur. Some temple chigo attempted to poison their masters, and some samurai wakashu tried to kill their lords and themselves in acts of revenge. Some kagama formed secret networks to support each other. These acts of defiance were usually unsuccessful and harshly punished, but they showed the human spirit's resilience. Resistance began as whispers, shared among boys in the dim temple halls. In the winter of 1156 AD, at the Todaiji Monastery in Nara, a chigo named Yoshimaru found something that changed his understanding of the world. Hidden under a loose floorboard in the scripture storage room was a collection of letters. These letters showed monks discussing the procurement of boys with the cold calculation of livestock traders. The one from Yamashina village shows promise, read one letter in elegant calligraphy. 12 years, fair complexion, family desperate after the rice harvest failed. Father agrees to terms. 50 mon now, 50 when delivered. Brother Kenjiro assures me the boy is untouched and properly fearful. Another letter detailed the process of breaking in new arrivals. Newcomers need careful handling. Start with small kindnesses, special food, and warmer robes to create gratitude and dependence. Gradually introduce physical demands, always under the guise of spiritual instruction. By the 3rd month, resistance is usually gone. Yoshimaru's hands trembled as he read these clinical descriptions of his own experience and that of every chigo he knew. The spiritual bond he had been taught to cherish was revealed as calculated manipulation. The sacred love between ninja and chigo was exposed as systematic abuse wrapped in religious language. But it was the final letter that turned Yoshimaru's horror into a glimmer of hope. Written by a monk named Shinran, it recounted his own years as a chigo and his eventual escape. I have found others like us, former temple boys who survived and remember. We meet in secret, sharing information about which monasteries to avoid and which monks are the most dangerous. We cannot undo what was done to us, but perhaps we can prevent it from happening to others. This letter contained something unprecedented: names and locations of safe places, coded language for identifying other survivors, even methods for forging travel documents that might allow a chigo to escape his monastery and vanish into the general population. Yoshimaru memorized every detail before carefully replacing the letters. That night, as his ninja snored beside him, he began planning not just his own escape, but something far more ambitious. If there were networks of survivors, if resistance was possible, then perhaps the seemingly absolute power of the monasteries was not so absolute after all. The first step was finding other chigo who might be ready to hear dangerous truths. This required extraordinary caution. Many boys had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they would report any sign of rebellion to their masters. Yoshimaru started with careful questions, testing responses, watching for signs of suppressed anger or desperate hope. His breakthrough came with a boy named Kenjiro, whose ninja had recently died, leaving him in limbo between masters. Kenjiro had experienced the predations of multiple monks and harbored a burning hatred that he'd learned to hide behind perfect obedience. When Yoshimaru shared what he'd discovered, Kenjiro's response was immediate. "Tell me what we must do." The network they built over the following months was necessarily small and secretive. 6 boys in total, ranging in age from 11 to 15, each carefully vetted and sworn to absolute secrecy. They communicated through a system of subtle gestures and coded phrases, passed information during routine temple activities, and met only in the deepest shadows of night, when the risks of discovery were lowest. Their first acts of resistance were small, but symbolically powerful. They started by tainting the monks' meals with mild irritants, herbs that upset the stomach, substances causing temporary rashes, or ingredients that made the tea bitter. Nothing was harmful enough to cause serious injury or obvious enough to be traced back to intentional sabotage, but it was enough to create unease among their oppressors. The psychological impact on the boys was profound. For the first time in their temple lives, they felt a sense of control. They became actors rather than victims, conspirators rather than helpless prey. Realizing they could retaliate, even in small ways, began to restore something that years of abuse had nearly destroyed their sense of self as human beings, with the power to influence their circumstances. As their confidence grew, so did their ambitions. Using information from secret letters, They began reaching out to the network of survivors described by Shinran. This required elaborate deceptions, finding reasons to visit nearby temples, bribing servants to carry messages, and learning to read and write, despite educational restrictions. The breakthrough came when they contacted a group of former temple boys who had become traveling merchants. These men, now in their 20s and 30s, had survived their own ordeals and were committed to helping current victims escape. They called themselves the Muko Kai, the Facing West Society. Reflecting the Buddhist concept of rebirth in the Pure Land, they saw themselves as helping souls escape suffering and find new life. The Muko Kai had developed sophisticated methods for extracting boys from monasteries. They would arrive at temples disguised as traveling merchants or pilgrims, establish contact with potential escapees, and create diversions, allowing boys to slip away unnoticed. Safe houses along trade routes offered shelter and new identities. A network of sympathetic merchants, farmers, and craftsmen provided jobs for those who successfully escaped. However, the system had limitations. It could only help boys who were already in contact with the network, who had shown both the desire to escape and the courage to take significant risks. Many boys, broken by years of abuse or genuinely convinced of their spiritual duty, couldn't be reached. Others were too closely monitored by suspicious masters to attempt escape. For Yoshimaru and his conspirators, contact with the Muko Kai opened new possibilities, but also revealed the true dangers they faced. Escaped boys who were recaptured faced punishments far worse than the routine brutalities of temple life. Some were permanently crippled to prevent future escape attempts, while others were tortured to death as examples to the remaining boys. The luckiest were simply expelled from the temples, facing certain starvation in a world that offered them no place. Despite the risks, knowing escape was possible changed the atmosphere within the monastery. The 6 conspirators began preparing other chigo for possible rescue, identifying those who might be open to help when the chance came. They gathered information about guard schedules, travel routes, and seasonal patterns that might affect escape attempts. The plan they developed was incredibly bold. Instead of individual escapes, they would coordinate a simultaneous disappearance of all trustworthy chigo, potentially 15 boys in total. This mass escape would save more lives and deliver a significant blow to the monastery's operations, making it impossible to hide or downplay the incident. The chosen date was the night of the Autumn Moon Festival, when the monks would be occupied with ceremonies and possibly distracted by ceremonial wine. Mukokai agents would be stationed at 3 different exit points from the temple complex. Travel documents, money, and disguises had been prepared. Safe houses along various escape routes were alerted and ready. Yet, no matter how carefully planned, human systems are prone to human failures. 2 days before the planned escape, a 13-year-old boy named Tadamani approached his ninja and revealed everything. Whether driven by fear, genuine religious belief, or some twisted form of Stockholm Syndrome, Tadamani provided full details about the conspiracy, the network, and the planned mass escape. The retribution was swift and ruthless. Yoshimaru awoke to find himself surrounded by armed temple guards, his hands bound, his mouth gagged to prevent him from warning others. One by one, each conspirator was dragged from their beds and assembled in the main hall before the entire temple community. What followed served as both punishment and theater, a public demonstration of the consequences for challenging the temple's authority. The head abbot, whose gentle public persona hid a capacity for extraordinary cruelty, personally oversaw the proceedings. As the identified leader, Yoshimaru received special attention. His punishment began with the removal of one finger from each hand, not severed cleanly, but slowly crushed with wooden mallets, while the assembled monks and chigo watched in horrified silence. The message was clear. These hands had written rebellious messages, conspired against the temple, and would never do so again. The other conspirators faced their own specific torments. Kenjiro, who had helped recruit others, had his tongue pierced with hot needles. He would never again speak words of rebellion. The younger boys received permanent scars on their forearms, marking them as former rebels and making any escape attempt impossible, even if they survived their current ordeal. But the physical abuse was only the beginning. The psychological torment was designed to crush not just the conspirators' will to resist, but their very sense of identity. They were forced to publicly confess, beg forgiveness from their ninja, and praise the temple authorities for sparing their lives and offering redemption. This redemption took the form of new roles within the temple hierarchy, turning them into cautionary examples of rebellion's consequences. Yoshimaru, unable to perform normal chigo duties due to his mutilated hands, was tasked with training new arrivals. He had to partake in the indoctrination process he once tried to undermine, convincing frightened newcomers that submission was their path to spiritual enlightenment. The irony was intentional and devastating. The monastery's leaders knew that turning former rebels into instruments of oppression was a more thorough victory than merely killing them. Each time Yoshimaru comforted a terrified new chigo or explained why obedience to one's ninja was sacred, a part of his spirit withered. Yet even in this apparent defeat, seeds of future resistance persisted. The network of former temple boys continued their mission, learning from past failures and refining their methods. The Muko Kai developed new protocols for vetting escapees, better security measures, and sophisticated ways to identify and avoid informants. Crucially, news of the rebellion spread despite the temple's efforts to suppress it. Other chigo and other monasteries heard whispers of boys who dared to fight back, who tried to seize control of their destinies. The story became a legend, inspiring future resistance. In the Ki Peninsula Mountains, a group of chigo at the Kumano Hongu Taisha started their conspiracy just months after learning of Yoshimaru's rebellion. Learning from his mistakes, they adopted stricter security, compartmentalized their organization to prevent total betrayal, and developed multiple contingency plans. Their leader, Jiro, had survived 3 years in the temple and had the intelligence to plan effectively and the charisma to inspire others. Unlike Yoshimaru, who tried to work within the temple structure, Jiro advocated for more direct action against their oppressors. During a secret meeting in the temple's root cellar, he told his fellow conspirators, "They have taught us to feel worthless. They have conditioned us to be thankful for mistreatment, viewing our suffering as sacred. But we've also learned to move quietly, anticipate their needs, and recognize their weaknesses. We'll turn their own training against them." Jiro's plan was more violent than Yoshimaru's. Instead of escaping, he suggested eliminating certain brutal monks, making their deaths seem accidental or from natural causes. This would create fear among the surviving monks, potentially leading to better treatment for the remaining chigo, while showing that the boys weren't as powerless as they seemed. The first target was Brother Nichiren, infamously cruel even by temple standards. Nichiren enjoyed devising harsh punishments for minor offenses, had permanently injured several chigo, and often bragged to other monks about his sexual exploits with the boys under his care. They chose poison, specifically from the deathcap mushroom, which grew abundantly in the nearby forests. Jiro learned about its properties from a former chigo who had escaped and returned secretly to share information. The poison was nearly undetectable when mixed with the bitter tea Nichiren drank each morning, mimicking a natural illness. The plan took months to prepare. The boy serving Nichiren's morning tea had to be trained to switch cups without being noticed, ensuring only the intended victim received the poison, and to act normally when the monk fell ill. Other conspirators established alibis, gathered mushrooms during legitimate activities, and prepared the extract with improvised tools. When Nichiren died from what seemed like a stomach illness, it had the psychological effect Jiro expected. The remaining monks became paranoid, suspicious, and hyper-vigilant about their food and drink, unsure which of the boys might be a threat. The temple's atmosphere shifted from casual brutality to nervous watchfulness. However, the success led to unexpected consequences. Increased surveillance made further assassinations almost impossible, as monks changed their routines and tested their food. More importantly, temple authorities brought in extra guards and implemented strict security measures, making life even more restrictive for all chigo. Jiro faced the same dilemma that resistance movements throughout history have encountered. The effectiveness of violent actions against oppressors in protecting those they aim to help remains debatable. Some conspirators believed that instilling fear was necessary to drive change, while others argued that increased repression worsened life for Chigo, who was uninvolved in the resistance. The debate was settled by external events. A provincial government inspector, during a routine temple finance review, uncovered irregularities, prompting more scrutiny of monastery operations. This official attention led temple authorities to focus on appearances, temporarily improving Chigo's treatment during the inspection. In this brief period, Jerome made a pivotal choice. Instead of targeting individual monks, he decided to document the systematic abuse within the temple system. By preserving and presenting this evidence to government officials, he hoped to achieve real change through official channels. This documentation project required different skills than assassination. Jiro needed to become fluent in writing, understand legal terminology, and gather convincing physical evidence for officials unfamiliar with temple life. He also had to establish secure communication with the outside world to ensure his evidence reached supportive recipients, avoiding interception by temple authorities. The task was slow and dangerous. Each document had to be hidden, each piece of evidence secured, and each contact with the outside world carefully managed to avoid detection. Jiro effectively ran an intelligence operation from within a closed institution, developing the necessary resources and skills independently. The breakthrough came when he connected with former samurai turned Buddhist monks who retained government connections. Horrified by the temple practices, they agreed to act as intermediaries with provincial authorities. Their social standing ensured that accusations against powerful monasteries were taken seriously. Jiro's completed dossier represented months of careful observation and documentation. It included detailed accounts of abuse incidents, financial records of payments for boys, correspondence among monks discussing illegal activities, and medical evidence of injuries sustained by chigo during their training. Perhaps most notably, it included testimonies from boys willing to risk everything to truthfully share their experiences. These accounts, written in the straightforward language of children describing unimaginable suffering, had an emotional impact that dry legal documents could never achieve. Submitting this evidence to provincial authorities marked a turning point in the fight against temple-based exploitation of male children. For the first time, official government attention was specifically focused on the systematic abuse within the monastery system. Investigations were launched, some monks were removed from their positions, and new regulations required external oversight of chigo training programs. Although the changes were limited and often superficial, they represented something unprecedented. Boys within the temple system now knew their suffering was not invisible to the outside world, that resistance was possible, and that their voices could be heard by those with the power to intervene. Word of Jiro's success spread through informal networks connecting chigo across different temples and regions. His methods were studied, adapted, and used by other groups of boys organizing their own resistance movements. The documentation approach was particularly appealing as it offered hope for systemic change rather than just individual escape or revenge. In monasteries across Japan, boys began keeping secret records of the abuse they witnessed and experienced. They developed codes for hiding these documents, methods for sharing information between temples, and strategies to ensure evidence would survive even if its creators were discovered and punished. Recognizing the threat of these documentation efforts, temple authorities implemented increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. They conducted random searches of chigo quarters, interrogated boys suspected of suspicious activities, and offered rewards to informants willing to betray their fellow victims. The conflict between oppressor and oppressed became a shadow war fought with information and secrecy rather than open violence. Some resistance movements combined documentation with more direct action. In the great monastery complex of Mount Hay, a group led by a chigo named Kisuke developed a two-pronged strategy of gathering evidence of abuse and sabotaging temple operations to reduce their effectiveness. Kisuke's followers became masters of subtle disruption. They would accidentally damage valuable manuscripts while copying them, introduce errors into important correspondence, and create scheduling conflicts that prevented monks from attending crucial meetings with potential donors or government officials. None of these actions were dramatic enough to trigger severe retaliation, but together they disrupted the monastery's operations and hindered its ability to acquire new victims. The brilliance of this strategy lay in turning the temple's focus on perfection and ritual precision against itself. In a setting where every ceremony needed to be flawless and every document perfectly accurate, even minor disruptions caused significant issues. The monks spent more time addressing sabotage than on their main activities. Meanwhile, documentation continued. Kisuke's network created the most thorough record of temple abuse ever compiled, including detailed floor plans showing where assaults typically happened, schedules indicating when monks were likely alone with victims, and psychological profiles of the system's most dangerous predators. This information was invaluable when government investigators arrived at Mount Hay. Instead of presenting a sanitized version of temple life, authorities were faced with detailed evidence of systematic criminality. Several monks were arrested, the monastery lost government funding, and new oversight mechanisms were implemented to prevent further abuses. More importantly, Mount Hay's success showed that organized resistance could achieve concrete results. Boys in temples across Japan began to believe that change was possible, that their suffering wasn't inevitable, and that they had the power to change their circumstances. Resistance movements started evolving beyond their initial focus on individual temples. Networks formed between different monasteries, allowing the sharing of information and resources over larger areas. Escape routes were set up to move boys from high-risk situations to safer places. Safe houses were established where former chigo could recover and learn skills to survive outside the temple. These networks also addressed a fundamental problem faced by escaped chigo: the lack of support systems after leaving the temple. Boys who spent years in monastic institutions often lacked understanding of normal social relationships, practical skills for earning a living, and family connections for assistance. The solution was creating alternative families, communities of survivors, providing mutual support, sharing resources, and helping newcomers adapt to life outside the temples. These communities often disguised themselves as legitimate businesses or religious organizations, running artisan workshops, small farms, or trading companies to provide economic support and social cover for their members. One of the most successful communities was set up in the port city of Sakai by a former chigo named Dogen, who had escaped a mountain monastery and spent years learning maritime trade. His company, specializing in importing Chinese goods, employed many former temple boys, offering them legitimate identities, practical skills, and a supportive environment for recovery. Dogen's operation also functioned as an intelligence hub for the broader resistance movement. Ships arriving from various ports carried coded messages between networks, updates on conditions in different temples, and requests for assistance with specific rescue operations. The company's legitimate business activities provided perfect cover for these communications, as merchants were expected to maintain extensive correspondence with contacts throughout the region. The success of communities like Dogen's began to change the dynamics that had made temple exploitation possible. Previously, boys had no realistic alternative but to accept their fate. Escape meant certain death from starvation or exposure. Now, for the first time, there were genuine opportunities for former chigo to build new lives. This shift had a profound psychological impact on boys still trapped in the temple system. Knowing that escape was possible and could lead to freedom transformed how they viewed their situation. Abuse that seemed permanent now appeared as a temporary condition that could be overcome with courage and planning. Temple authorities recognized the threat of these alternative communities and attempted various countermeasures. They pressured government officials to investigate suspicious businesses employing many young men without clear family histories and spread rumors about former chigo being unreliable or criminal. They even hired informants to infiltrate the survivor communities and report on their activities. However, these efforts largely failed. The survivor communities had developed sophisticated security measures, legitimate business operations that could withstand scrutiny, and strong internal bonds, making infiltration extremely difficult. More importantly, they gained the support of increasing numbers of ordinary citizens, aware of temple abuses and sympathetic to the victims. This broader social support marked a crucial shift in the context of temple-based exploitation. What was once an accepted, though rarely discussed, aspect of religious life was increasingly viewed as a disgraceful practice that tarnished both Buddhism and Japanese society. Public opinion was gradually turning against the institutions responsible for these abuses over the centuries. The shift in social attitudes was hastened by the increasing availability of written accounts revealing temple life from the victims' perspectives. Former chigo, who had learned to write, began creating memoirs, testimonies, and exposés that reached educated audiences throughout Japan. These documents, circulated through informal networks and sometimes published by sympathetic merchants or scholars, provided the first widespread public awareness of what really happened within monastery walls. One of the most influential accounts was by a man named Shinran, the same person whose letter had sparked Yoshimaru's original resistance movement. Now in his 40s and a successful craftsman, Shinran wrote a detailed memoir of his years as a temple boy, honestly recounting the horrors he faced while remaining hopeful about recovery and renewal. Shinran's account was powerful because it avoided sensationalism and self-pity, instead offering a clear analysis of how systematic abuse was disguised as spiritual training. He described the psychological methods used to break down boys' resistance, the economic motivations for temples to acquire new victims, and the social structures that allowed these practices to persist, unchallenged. Most importantly, Shinran's memoir showed that survival was possible, and that former victims could overcome their experiences to build meaningful lives. This hopeful message strongly resonated with current chigo, who were starting to organize their own resistance movements, providing both inspiration and practical guidance. Accounts like Shinran's created a feedback loop that strengthened the resistance movement on multiple levels. Boys still trapped in temples gained information to understand their situations and plan escapes. Survivor communities found validation and encouragement to continue their work. Crucially, the general public, previously unaware of the abuses, began to demand official action. This rising public awareness coincided with broader societal changes in Japan that made reform more likely. The rise of a merchant class with growing political influence, the gradual centralization of government authority, and an increased focus on rational administration over traditional privilege created more favorable conditions for protecting victims of institutional abuse. The first significant legal breakthrough occurred in 1189 AD when the Kamakura shogunate issued new regulations for Buddhist monasteries. These rules, while still granting temples considerable autonomy, required external oversight of the treatment of chigo and established specific penalties for monks involved in sexual abuse of minors. The regulations were not perfect, enforcement was inconsistent, penalties were often light, and many temples found ways to evade oversight while maintaining abusive practices. However, they signified official recognition that the treatment of temple boys was a legitimate government concern, not just an internal religious matter beyond secular authority. More importantly, the regulations provided a legal framework for resistance movements to support their activities. Boys who escaped from temples could now seek official protection rather than being automatically returned to their masters. Evidence of abuse could be presented to government officials with the reasonable expectation of investigation rather than being ignored. These legal changes, combined with the growing network of survivor communities and the increasing sophistication of resistance movements within temples, began to reshape the dynamics around the exploitation of male children in religious institutions. What was once a closed system operating without external scrutiny was now subject to pressure from victims, survivors, and sympathetic members of broader society. Temple authorities' responses to these challenges varied. Some monasteries attempted to reform, implementing new safeguards for chigo and restricting abusive monks. Others became more secretive, developing better methods to avoid detection while continuing to exploit vulnerable boys. A few monasteries, recognizing the old system was untenable, transitioned away from using child attendants altogether. They recruited adult servants for domestic duties, hired professional scribes for copying work, and modified religious practices to eliminate roles traditionally filled by chigo. However, many temples, especially those in remote areas with limited government oversight, continued their traditional practices with minimal changes. These became refuges for monks unwilling or unable to adapt to new expectations about treating children, creating pockets of intense abuse, even as conditions improved elsewhere. Resistance movements adapted to the evolving landscape by developing more targeted strategies. Instead of trying to reform the entire temple system, they focused on the institutions and individuals posing the greatest threats to vulnerable boys. Intelligence networks identified the most dangerous monasteries, optimized escape routes to rescue victims from high-risk situations, and prepared survivor communities to take in larger numbers of refugees as enforcement actions forced boys from closed temples. This focused approach proved highly effective. By concentrating resources on the worst cases, these movements achieved dramatic results in specific situations while building momentum for broader reforms. Success stories accumulated, temples closed due to scandals, prominent monks prosecuted for abuse, and thriving survivor communities. Each victory, however limited, encouraged continued resistance and showed that change was possible. Boys still trapped in abusive situations saw concrete evidence that escape was feasible, justice achievable, and that they were not forgotten by the outside world. These individual successes began to create broader changes in Japanese society's approach to child protection. What started as isolated resistance within specific temples evolved into a general recognition that adults had a responsibility to protect young people from exploitation, regardless of the institutional context. This shift extended beyond religious institutions, influencing attitudes toward other forms of child abuse and exploitation. The arguments used to challenge temple practices that children deserved protection, that adult authority could be questioned, that systematic abuse required systematic responses began to apply to other societal issues. The boy who once knelt on cold monastery steps, feeling the weight of his new life like chains, was no longer alone. Across Japan, in temples, safe houses, government offices, and merchant shops, and through hidden networks connecting survivors and supporting communities, thousands worked to ensure his story would not be repeated. The resistance that began with whispered conversations between frightened children grew into a movement, transforming Japanese society's approach to protecting its most vulnerable members. The journey was far from over. Many boys still suffered in remote temples. Many perpetrators escaped justice. Many survivors struggled with lasting trauma. But the trajectory was clear. The era of unchecked exploitation of young boys in religious institutions was drawing to a close. This change wasn't due to the mercy of those in power, but rather the bravery of those who had endured suffering and refused to accept it as their fate. The resistance persisted, rescuing one boy at a time, reforming one temple at a time, changing one mind at a time, until the unimaginable became inevitable, and the impossible turned real. By the early 13th century, the transformation was undeniable. Where temple bells once tolled over silent anguish, they now rang over communities where former victims had found their voices. The scattered safe houses had grown into established neighborhoods in major cities, where men carried subtle reminders of their past, but walked with the dignity of having reclaimed their lives. Yoshimaru, now graying, but still driven by the same fierce determination that ignited the first resistance, stood before an unprecedented gathering. In the main hall of a once-abandoned warehouse in Kyoto, nearly 200 men sat in neat rows. Some had the weathered faces of craftsmen, others the ink-stained fingers of scribes, and still others the calloused hands of farmers. What united them wasn't visible at a glance, but connected them more deeply than blood or birth. They were all survivors. 23 years ago, Yoshimaru began, his voice resonating through the hall. A boy named Kenjiro whispered to me in a temple corridor that he wanted to see the ocean. He had never seen beyond monastery walls and dreamed of waves and endless sky. He paused, scanning the faces before him. Kenjiro sits among us today, not as that frightened child, but as a master shipwright whose vessels now carry merchants safely across the waters he once only imagined. A man in the third row, his face weathered by sea wind, raised his hand slightly in acknowledgement. Others around him nodded with the quiet pride of those who understood the magnitude of such a transformation. But we are not here to celebrate only our journeys, Yoshimaru continued. We are here because there are still boys whispering dreams in dark corridors, still children who feel powerless against tradition and authority. We are here because our work is not finished. The gathering marked the first formal Congress of the Restoration Fellowship, a network that now spanned the entire Japanese archipelago. What began as desperate cooperation between individual survivors had evolved into an unprecedented, coordinated effort to transform the structures that enabled systematic abuse. The fellowship's influence extended far beyond its membership. In the decades following the initial escapes, former chigo had carved out roles in nearly every significant trade and profession. They became doctors who understood trauma, teachers who could recognize signs of abuse, and merchants who offered employment without questioning missing family histories. Their shared experiences created an invisible support network, offering protection to vulnerable individuals throughout society. Master Endo, once a temple boy, and now one of Kyoto's most esteemed builders, unveiled the fellowship's latest project. We have acquired the property known as the Riverside Monastery, he announced, holding a formal deed. It will be transformed into our first training center, a place where survivors can learn trades, where their children can be educated, and where we can teach our methods to others. The choice of location was deeply symbolic. The Riverside Monastery had been infamous for its harsh treatment of chigo and the powerful monks who operated with complete impunity. Now, it would become a beacon of hope, its halls filled with voices once silenced. The monastery's transformation represented more than just a symbolic victory. It marked the fellowship's evolution from a desperate resistance movement to a legitimate social institution with real power to effect change. Acquiring the property legally required negotiating with government officials and collaborating with religious authorities, a feat made possible by years of proving their value as productive members of society. As the Congress continued, reports flowed in from across the country. The fellowship's now formalized and extensive intelligence network tracked conditions in remaining temples and identified new victims needing assistance. Their methods had grown sophisticated, maintaining contacts within active monasteries, operating safe houses along escape routes, and developing legal strategies to protect boys seeking help. Most importantly, they learned to work within the system rather than merely against it. Former chigo entered government service, using their positions to craft and enforce new regulations. Others joined reformed Buddhist sects, helping establish new monastic models focused on genuine spiritual development over exploitation. Some became teachers and scholars, ensuring the history of temple abuse would not be forgotten or repeated. The Congress's afternoon session focused on prevention work efforts to identify and protect vulnerable children before victimization. This represented a fundamental shift in approach. Instead of merely reacting to abuse after it happened, they were now focusing on preventing it altogether. Matsuda, a former chigo turned respected physician, shared his research on identifying families at risk of selling their children to temples. He explained that while poverty is the main factor, it's not the only one. Families disrupted by warfare, natural disasters, or social upheaval are especially vulnerable to the deceptive promises of temple recruiters. The fellowship had developed a comprehensive strategy to tackle this issue. They provided emergency aid to families in crisis, offered alternative placements for children whose families couldn't care for them, and collaborated with local authorities to ensure these placements were truly beneficial, not exploitative. Their success in preventing abuse was evident not in dramatic rescues, but in the quiet lives of children who never experienced the horrors of their own childhoods. As evening approached, the Congress focused on its most ambitious project yet, establishing a formal school for former temple boys and their children. This institution would offer not only basic education, but also training and skills needed for success in a rapidly changing society. More importantly, it would serve as a model for structuring education to support, rather than exploit, vulnerable youth. "We are not just creating a school," explained Akiko, one of the few women in the fellowship's leadership. Her story was remarkable, as the daughter of a former chigo, dedicated to supporting survivors and their families. "We are creating a new vision of nurturing children's potential instead of exploiting their vulnerability. The school would revolutionize traditional Buddhist education, replacing harsh discipline and rigid hierarchy with a focus on individual development, critical thinking, and practical skills, enabling graduates to support themselves and their families. Most importantly, it would be staffed by people who understood trauma and were committed to healing rather than perpetuating abuse." As the formal sessions ended, the gathering transformed. Men who had once been isolated in their suffering now shared stories of triumph and renewal. They spoke of marriages, children, businesses built from scratch, and contributions to their communities that went far beyond their roles as survivors. They laughed together, these men who once thought they'd never find joy. Yet beneath the celebration lay a deeper understanding. They knew their work would never be truly finished. Each generation would encounter new forms of exploitation, new institutions claiming authority over the vulnerable, and new justifications for abusing power. The specific horrors of the temple system might be ending, but humanity's fundamental capacity for cruelty and exploitation would persist. However, What they had created was something that could outlast any single institution or system of abuse. They had shown that resistance was possible, recovery was achievable, and systematic change could arise from the courage of those who suffered most. They proved that victims were not powerless, that traditional authority was not beyond question, and that society could be transformed by those it once discarded. The Congress concluded with a ceremony honoring both the dead and the living. Names were read aloud, boys who hadn't survived their time in the temples, men who died before seeing the changes they helped create, and current members of the fellowship continuing the work. Each name was followed by a moment of silence, then the sound of a single bell, clear and strong in the evening air. The final speaker was an elderly man named Tai Chi, one of the few survivors of the earliest resistance efforts. His voice was weak, but his words carried the authority of lived experience. "We who were once voiceless have found our voices," he said simply. "We who were once powerless have discovered our strength. We who were once alone have built community. We who were once without hope have created hope for others. This is our victory. Not that we have forgotten our suffering, but that we have transformed it into something that serves life rather than death, healing rather than harm." As the gathering dispersed, men embraced who had once been strangers, united only by trauma. They made plans for the future, exchanged information about family and work, and promised to maintain the connections that sustained them through the darkest times. They walked into the Kyoto night as free men, carrying the knowledge that they had achieved something extraordinary. The boy who had once knelt on cold monastery steps, trembling with fear and confusion, lived on in their memories not as a symbol of victimhood, but as a reminder of the capacity for transformation. His story had become their story. His fear had become their strength. His silence had become their voice. The chains that once bound him were broken, not by divine intervention or the mercy of the powerful, but by the patient, persistent work of ordinary people who refused to accept that suffering was inevitable. The resistance succeeded not because it destroyed the temple system, though it fundamentally transformed it, but because it created something better. In place of institutions that consumed the vulnerable, they built communities that nurtured them. Instead of systems that perpetuated abuse, networks had been established to prevent it. Instead of silence and shame, truth and healing were fostered. The temple bell still rang across Japan, but their sound carried new meanings. For some, they continued to mark the rhythm of spiritual practice. For others, they served as reminders of past suffering. But for the members of the Restoration Fellowship and the countless lives they had touched, those bells had become something entirely different, a call to vigilance, a summons to service, and a promise that no child would ever again face the darkness alone. The work continued as it always would, but now it was fueled by hope rather than desperation, by community instead of isolation, and by the understanding that change was not only possible, but inevitable, when ordinary people chose to act with extraordinary courage. The age of unchallenged exploitation was ending, replaced by an era where the vulnerable would always have protectors, the silenced would always find voices, and the darkness would always be challenged by those who had learned to kindle light.